Rachmaninoff once said of music that music is enough for a lifetime, but that a lifetime is not enough for a music. Now, I feel the same way about cooking. There's always something new to learn. There's always an excuse to get back into the kitchen. But I understand for the uninitiated, just learning how to cook, it can be really intimidating. Well, today I've got great news for you. And the great news is simply this. In all of cookery, there are only 4 cooking techniques. That's it. Now, I know you might think that you can rattle off 10 or 12 just like that. There's braising, there's stewing, there's poaching, simmering, steaming, sautéing, roasting, you name it. But 4 is it. Dry heat cooking with fat, dry heat cooking without fat, moist heat cooking, and combination cooking. That's it. 4 techniques. Let me fill in some of the blanks. Dry heat cooking with fat embraces things like sauté and stir fry, where fat is important. Dry heat cooking without fat doesn't need fat, so grilling, broiling, baking, roasting. Moist heat cooking is a technique that embraces liquid. Things like poaching, simmering, boiling, those are all moist heat cooking techniques. And then finally, combination cooking, as the name suggests, embraces more than one technique. So braising and stewing. If you think about braising a piece of meat, you begin by sautéing it over high heat to brown it, and then you introduce liquid, you turn the temperature down, and you simmer it gently in moist heat until it's tender. That's it. 4 techniques. Now, the beauty of categorizing cooking like this is that when you have this framework to hang your understanding on, you don't come to the kitchen with each new recipe unprepared. You bring with you everything that you know about those techniques. And when you pick up a new recipe, you look at it and you understand it. This is sauté, or this is roast, or this is braise or stir fry. And you build on your knowledge rather than going back to square one. That's it. That's the way we're going to approach cooking. Today, we're going to focus just on dry heat cooking with fat. Sauté. So, dry heat cooking with fat can be a little bit confusing because on one hand, we're saying the heat will be dry, and on the other hand, we've got liquid fat in the pan. Here's what you need to understand, and I've got a little demonstration set up for you over here. There is a difference between water and oil, or water and fat. Here I've got a pan of water boiling. The temperature of that boiling water is 212 degrees, and regardless of how high the heat is, the temperature will stick at 212 degrees until it all changes phase and becomes steam, changes into vapor. This pan is very, very hot, and I'm going to put some oil in there. And when I do, you'll see that the oil will begin to heat up. Now, every oil has a different tolerance to heat. Some of them very low, some very high. Let's take a look here. In goes the oil. Already it begins to creep around the pan, and then what you'll notice very quickly is that it starts to smoke. That is the smoke point of this oil. That's where it begins to break down. If I ignore that, the smoke point will quickly go to the flash point. And so I'm going to pull it off the heat. If you reach the flash point and your pan catches fire, put a lid on it, pull it off the heat, and the lid will starve the fire of oxygen, and then you can just let it die out. The significance of oil over water is that it allows us to get the temperature of this cooking method much, much higher. This sauté, or dry heat cooking with fat, is a high temperature cooking technique, and those high temperatures allow us to brown food very effectively. And browned food not only looks better, but it has a much better flavor. So, dry heat cooking with fat. Today, I'm going to show you that with a simple dish, chicken marsala. I've got some chicken breast right here, and what I'd like to do is show you how to take a chicken breast that's almost completely boneless and turn it into what's known as an airline breast. I'm going to cut the bone, the end of the bone off, and what will happen as this cooks is that the meat will draw down this bone, and it'll look just like that. So there's a second chicken breast. Let me move this board out of the way, and I'm going to wash my hands quickly. What I have all gathered here is what's known as mise en place. This is everything that I'm going to need to make this dish. Not only the cooking ingredients, but also the equipment. I've got a pair of tongs right here. I've got hand tools. Over here, I've got pans, and then of course the stove is in place. The two pans I've got laid out here are sauté pans. This one is called a sautoir. You can see it with straight sides, and this over here, a sauteuse with curved sides. This is great for flipping food in a pan because the curved sides help the food jump back on itself. The straight sides is maybe a little bit better if you want to create a sauce with a lot of liquid. So this is what we're going to be using today. Now, here's the chicken. I'm going to season it real briefly. A little bit of salt and also some pepper. And I'm going to do it on both sides. And what I'd love to show you is exactly what it looks like when you have a pan that's too small for the amount of food. If I were to take this pan right here, this sauteuse, and take these two chicken breasts and lay them in here to cook, what you would discover is that the pan is just too small. There's no way that the stove and the pan could keep up with this much food. And at the end of the day, what you'd end up with is food that didn't brown, but instead food that just simmered in its own liquid. So I'm not going to use a pan that's that small. Instead, I'm going to use a larger pan. Now, this is a high heat cooking technique, so I want plenty of heat in the thermal mass of that pan to begin with. If you look, I've got this burner turned up all the way. I've got an oil right here. This is canola oil, but any oil that has a high smoke point would be appropriate. It needs to be able to tolerate the high heat of sauté. And if I put it into the pan, there's a couple of clues that this pan is hot already. The oil begins to creep around, or some people say the oil smiles back at you. That's one sign. And then also, as I look at it, I'm looking for the first few wisps of smoke. That tells me that this oil is as hot as it can get. It's reached its smoke point, and unless I do something, the oil is going to start to develop off flavors. The something that I'm going to do is not turn the heat down, but instead add food to the pan, and that will bring the temperature down. Right now, I'm seeing the first few wisps of smoke. That's my clue to move ahead. So when you put the food into the pan, put it in away from you so that you don't burn yourself, you don't splash any food on yourself. Just like that. We're already getting some feedback from this pan. You hear that sizzling. That sizzling is really the moisture inherent in that meat beginning to boil. And so that's a good sign. What I don't want to see is too much gray smoke coming out of that pan. That would tell me that I've got the heat too high and that the oil is beginning to burn. Now, let's say for argument's sake that I had a pan that was not too small or not the right size, but way too big. Now, there's portions of the pan that have no food in it, and because there's nothing absorbing that excess heat, the oil is going to burn in those areas where there is no food. The little bit of smoke or steam that you see coming off of this pan right now is not oil burning, but instead simply moisture turning to steam. While this is cooking, let's talk about the foodstuffs that are appropriate for sauté. Sauté is a high heat cooking technique, and because it's a high heat cooking technique, you have to be a little bit careful what you cook. There's nothing about high heat that will make food become more tender. So anything that's tender, like a chicken breast or like a steak or a piece of fish, would be appropriate for sauté. But if I made the mistake of taking something that was tough, like a beef shank, and putting it in here, it would brown, but it just would not get tender. To be silly for just a second, if I put a piece of shoe leather in this pan, what's going to come out is a cooked piece of shoe leather. Now, if I pick this up and take a look at it, you can see that already some browning is beginning to take place. I'm going to turn the temperature down just a little bit because I recognize we've got a fairly thick piece of chicken here. I usually figure about 8 minutes per inch of thickness. So the way I'm going to earn my money is regulate the heat so that I don't get too much browning early on, and I can keep this food in the pan for, 6 to 8 minutes. When the pan is hot and I put the food in, typically I put it in on the side that I consider the presentation side. Basically, I want the side that will be facing up when I give it to the guest to go into the pan when the pan is nice and clean. That way, the presentation side will be the most attractive side. If you listen now, the sizzling has calmed down a little bit. The pan again is telling me or giving me information. We need to decide when it's appropriate to turn this. I would say the answer is pretty simple. We want the browning on the first side to have progressed to the point where the fat is rendered out of the skin. There's a nice golden color, and then we can turn it over and cook it from the second side. We are just about there now. If you take a look, the fat is rendered out of the skin, and if you take a look, there's a nice golden color. I'm going to turn this over, and we'll let it cook on the second side. You can see already the flesh is beginning to pull down the bone, and this is becoming a Frenched or an airline chicken breast. It takes its name from the fact that chicken butchered this way used to be served on the airlines. I know that there's a good deal of cooking that still needs to happen, and so I've turned the temperature down even a little bit further so it can cook gently. On the second side, the meat of this chicken breast, which is fairly lean, is not protected by the skin. So I want to have even a more gentle heat. 8 to 10 minutes is what I figured. So we've got a little bit of time here for this to cook very, very gently. All right, our chicken is almost done cooking. You can see it here in the pan. What I want to do is remove it to the side because we've got a sauce that needs to be made. So you can see it's got nice golden color on the back. Likewise, the skin is crispy. It comes out. And let me show you what is in this pan. There is a certain amount of liquid. Some of it is the fat that I started to use for sautéing, and some of it is the juices that came out of this chicken as it cooked. Now, if we want to separate the fat from the liquid and just have the chicken essence, what you do is you put it on the stove over the heat and you boil that liquid until it's gone dry and it will cling to the pan. At that point, you can pour the excess fat off. So that's what's happening right now. Depending on how much moisture is in that liquid, it may take, a minute or two, but at this point, don't ever let that liquid get so dark that it burns and becomes bitter. When you stop hearing that sizzling, that's telling you there's no more moisture in there. So we're getting very, very close. Good. I'm going to pour off most of the fat and set it aside. And into this pan, I'm going to throw some minced shallots. They are cut so small that they will cook very, very quickly. I'm also going to throw some sliced mushrooms. And we'll put this back on the heat and we'll just saute them. Because these vegetables have been cut already, they will cook really, really quickly. Now, what the French would call the brown residue on the bottom is fond, or a foundation. This is really the essence of chicken. And from this point forward, be very, very careful not to allow that to get too dark or to burn. You can hear the sizzling. That's the moisture in the mushrooms coming out. But if it ever threatens to get too dark, then we're going to deglaze this pan. We're going to introduce a little bit of white wine. And with the introduction of liquid, we brought the temperature down to 212 degrees. And I can take my tongs and just scrape the residue off the bottom of the pan. I would encourage you just to taste this, and when you do, you'll recognize how rich and savory and of roasted chicken this pan tastes right now. Because I used some wine, it has a little bit of acidity, and that is the basis for our sauce. I'm going to introduce some Marsala, sort of a sweet wine. And already, if you look into this pan, you will see the intense, deep color that comes from dry heat cooking with fat. It's a high heat cooking technique, and now we've got a lot of browning, which translates as not just a beautiful sauce, but something that's going to taste really great as well. So this I want to reduce, and I want to reduce it down until it's nearly dry. I would have you think of this as a flavor essence. We'll take this flavor essence, almost dry, and we will use that to become the basis for our sauce. We'll need a vehicle to carry that flavor to the plate, and in this particular recipe, that vehicle is going to be cream. So let's let this simmer for just a second, and we'll get it a little bit dry, what the French would say au sec, or almost dry. If you decide you want a larger amount of sauce, once this has come down and it's reduced almost dry, you can introduce some chicken stock, and I'll add some of that. And what will happen is that as the chicken stock begins to reduce, I will reinforce the flavor of chicken. So I'll not only have more sauce, but I'll have a sauce of fuller and more distinctive flavor. It's tasting now of chicken. Which is entirely appropriate because it's going on a chicken dish. Again, I want to bring this down so the flavor is too concentrated. And I will use that concentrated flavor to flavor my finished sauce, which uses cream as a vehicle. While this is simmering, I'm going to also add a quick bay leaf and maybe a branch of thyme, just to make more complexity. And again, this takes a little bit of time to simmer. It may seem awkward that we've got our chicken all cooked and ready to go, but there's something important happening over here with the chicken, and that is that as this cooked, as it heated up, pressure begins to build up inside of that meat. And if you were to cut into it too quickly after having cooked it, that pressure would allow all the juices to flow out, almost in an awkward way. So what's happening here is it's resting in a warm spot. The temperature is starting to subside a little bit. The pressure is going down. The juices are flowing back to where they belong. And we will, at the end of the day, have a juicier piece of meat for having it allowed to rest for just a little bit of time. I am a big fan of tasting as you go. So now I can taste not only the chicken, but also the acidity of the first wine, the Sauvignon Blanc that went in the pan. I can also taste the wonderful sweetness that comes from an off-dry Marsala. The herbs that I've added, the thyme and the bay, and even the mushrooms and shallots, lend complexity. And you can see now it's nearly dry. So we're going to add the cream to this pan. Now, how much cream? You need enough sauce for both of those chicken breasts. Any more sauce than that would just water down the flavor of your sauce. So don't be too generous. And as this reduces even a little bit further, it will start to thicken. And I'm going to clear the decks so that we can plate this dish. The chicken can go back into the sauce just to warm up very, very briefly. I'm going to turn it down because it's starting to get a little bit thick. I'm going to keep the chicken skin side up so that the skin can stay crispy. I don't want to put that into the liquid and simmer it. So skin side up, and at this point I'm going to turn it off because I'm pretty happy with the consistency of the sauce. What I still need to do is some final simmering. Final seasoning. Now, the question I would ask you is, what's the role of a sauce? It needs to make the dish taste good, but it needs to make the whole dish taste good. Not just the sauce, but the sauce and the chicken. It should actually be more assertive. It shouldn't taste good right off the spoon. It should taste good as part of the whole dish. So it may need actually to be more assertive than you would expect it to taste on the spoon. I'm going to season it with salt and swirl that in. I'm going to add a little bit of pepper, swirl that in as well. At this point, I can reach in and take the bay leaf out. The thyme can come out. And one chicken breast. And two. If you take a look at this sauce, the French have a term, nappé, for a sauce that coats the back of a spoon. And you can see it happening right here. That's exactly what we want. It should be fluid, it should be liquid, but it should coat the back of a spoon. Most people would agree that about 2 ounces of sauce is a reasonable portion. And I think that's about how we're doing here. I'm going to set that aside and just clean this plate up a little bit. And there's one last thing that I would like to do, and that is put a little bit of chopped parsley on the top. It's just a little bit too monochromatic for me right now. A little bit too brown. So a little bit of green will make the colors pop right there. It doesn't take very much. That's it. Chicken marsala. It has mushrooms, it has the wonderful sweet flavor of an off-dry wine, and a tender chicken breast that has plenty of browning because we practiced a high-heat cooking technique. dry heat cooking with fat, or sauté. Okay, we just finished chicken marsala. Now I'd like to show you another chicken dish, a little more rustic and maybe a little easier. I've got a chicken breast right here, and you can see the wing bone has already been removed. I'm going to pull off the skin, and it's as easy as just getting under one edge and pulling it away. And you can see a little bit of fat. I'm going to trim that fat off. And we're going to turn this chicken breast into what's known in France anyways as a paillard. A paillard is a thin straw mat. And what they used to do is take a tougher cut of meat and pound it very, very thin until it was tender. We're going to do it with a cut of meat that's a chicken breast, something that's already tender. And I'm going to pound it in plastic bags. This is a Ziploc bag. And I just want to pull the ends and the edges off so that I can open it up. And we'll take the chicken breast and put it in here. Cover it over with plastic so that it spreads very, very easily. And then we'll take a mallet and just pound it gently. And what I want to do is make sure that this chicken breast is uniformly thick. Now let's say for argument's sake that you don't have a nice mallet like this. Just go and grab a pot or a pan, and you can use that as well. Okay, now this chicken breast is probably 1/4 the thickness it was. And because it's 1/4 the thickness, it will cook 4 times faster. I'm going to turn the heat up on this pan. And we're going to season this chicken breast with salt. And I'm going to put a lot of pepper on it. This is sort of a cracked pepper dish. We'll season it on the second side as well. I've got, in this case, olive oil, which has a nice high smoke point as well, probably up around 375, 385 degrees. And we'll put that into the pan. Because the pan is hot, already the oil begins to creep around a little bit. There's the smoke. I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it into the pan away from myself, presentation side down. While that begins to cook, everything that had raw chicken on it should be taken away. And I'm going to wash my hands. Just as a quick review, if you take a look, this is a nice sized pan for this chicken breast. The temperature is a little bit hotter, and the reason for that is that the food is thinner, so it won't be in the pan for as long. Okay? We can monitor its progress. It's starting to brown pretty nicely. What you'll discover is that when the pan is nice and hot like this, almost nothing will stick. It's only when you put food into a pan that's a little bit cool that you can run into problems with sticking. All right, that looks nice. The next thing I would like to do is prepare a quick salad. And if you look here, I've got some nice arugula. I'm also going to add some little bits of radicchio and a few cherry tomatoes. That salad we're going to set aside. We're getting some really nice color on this first side. I want it to be nice and golden. We'll turn it, and maybe we've got another minute's worth of cooking. Okay, time to turn this chicken. And you can see, beautiful golden color. Nothing burnt, nothing too crusty. The second side, because the chicken breast is already hot, will cook very, very quickly. So I'm going to gather a few things up. The way to determine doneness on a chicken breast like this, there's a number of different ways, but maybe the easiest for something that's thin like this is to just poke it. And the way to understand what you feel is this. If you relax your hand and just let it hang like this, poke yourself right there in the thick part of your palm, and you should feel like raw meat, just the way that this would feel if I hadn't cooked it at all. So that's what raw meat feels like. Touch your thumb to your first finger. Just touch it, don't press, and it will firm up here almost imperceptibly. That's what rare meat feels like. Touch your thumb to your middle finger. That's what medium meat feels like. Your ring finger feels a little bit like medium well, and your pinky, that's what well done meat feels like. In the case of chicken, we want this to be cooked all the way to well done. So it should feel just like that. And we're almost there now. Obviously, test it in the thickest part of the meat because that's what's going to resist heat the longest. I feel pretty good about this, so I'm going to grab this chicken breast, give it just a second or two on the second side for browning to happen, and then we'll remove it to the pan and let it rest. Before, we made a pretty complex sauce, a sauce that had cream and chicken and vegetables. What we're going to make for this dish is a salad dressing. Olive oil, lemon juice, salt, pepper, boom, that's it. All right, this comes out. And I don't want to leave the empty pan on the heat for too long, but you can see the fond there on the bottom of the pan, all that brown goodness. I'm going to deglaze this pan with chicken stock. This will reinforce the chicken flavor of the paillard, and I want to reduce that down almost dry. I don't want a lot of extra liquid. I want the chicken essence to flavor my vinaigrette. So this will take maybe a minute to reduce all the way down dry. I've got a lemon here, and we're going to use lemon as the acidity that makes its way into our vinaigrette. We'll get rid of some of these seeds, but I've always said that if every once in a while a lemon seed makes its way into your dish, at least the people you're cooking for know you're using fresh lemons. So, lemon's ready, salad's here. Probably got just enough time to season this salad with some salt and pepper. I am a huge advocate of seasoning all parts of a dish. So don't be seasoning this too much because there's no season over here. Instead, season this the way you want it to taste, season this the way you want it to taste, and season this the way you want it to taste. While we're waiting for this to reduce, let's talk a little bit more about browning. Because this is a high heat cooking technique, we can get temperatures above 300 degrees. And in those temperature ranges, we can see some browning reactions to take place. One that you're probably all familiar with is caramelization, where sugars begin to brown. That happens at about 300 to 310 degrees. There's another called the Maillard reaction that takes place between protein and carbohydrates, and while it begins at about 250 degrees, it really takes off above 300 degrees. Even at 250 degrees, it's hotter than boiling. So, what is the benefit of the Maillard reaction? Well, we certainly get the nice brown color, and you can see it starting to develop in this pan. But more than that, we get hundreds and hundreds of flavor and aroma compounds. And assuming we don't overdo it and burn our chicken breast, we tend to love the way those things smell and love the way they taste. Browning really translates as flavor. So let's see what we've got here. This is reduced down almost completely dry. I'm going to add some acid to it. This is lemon juice. And I'll at least make an effort to take out the seeds. I'll leave one in for good measure. And then I'm going to season this sauce with a little bit of salt and pepper. And finally, I'm going to add olive oil as though I were making a vinaigrette. Now, my preferred ratio for a vinaigrette is 1 part acid to 3 parts 1 part acid to 3 parts oil. But we've also got a little bit of chicken glaze in here, and so maybe slightly less oil than 3 parts. It's just a little dry. I want to make sure there's no brown fond stuck to the bottom of the pan. And again, I want this to be too sharp, too salty, too peppery, with the understanding that by the time it gets on the greens and on the chicken, everything will be right with the world. Okay. Chicken looks good. There's a little bit of moisture that's bled from the chicken, and I'm going to add that to my vinaigrette. And I think we can take a little bit of this warm vinaigrette and use it to dress the greens here. We'll toss those together. I'm actually a big advocate of tasting all the way along. You probably understand that about me already. The real way to evaluate a vinaigrette would be to taste it on the salad that it accompanies. And if you think it could use a little more acid or a little more salt, you can always add it. So let me bring this plate up here, and we'll start to put together a very simple salad that you might have for dinner on a Sunday night from what's left behind in your refrigerator. You've got that 1 chicken breast. You pound it out very thin. You've got some greens left over. We'll put the chicken in there. And I just love the looks of these cherry tomatoes, so I'm going to sprinkle a few of those on top of the chicken. And we'll set that aside. And then finally, just a little bit of this sauce to make things glisten and taste great. Let's put this over here. So let's take a quick look at this dish. We've got all manner of vegetables. We've got a nice piece of protein. We've got a delicious sauce that is made from the essence of the chicken that we've added to this dish. Really the only thing missing here would be some sort of a starch. And for our purposes, I'm thinking just some grilled bread or toasted bread would be all I needed. This is a warm salad of arugula, radicchio, and Belgian endive with a paillard of chicken cooked just so. This dish right here is a perfect example of a rustic sauté, something that you could do easily at home, and I'm sure you'd enjoy it.